It's a range. I mean, we usually get between 35 and 80.
Wow. Okay, cool.
Somewhere
Yeah, I
in the
tried to
middle
gear
there.
it more towards, I'm hoping that maybe we have a few like PhD student or early career folks who show up, because I tried gearing it towards their level of trying to explain a few acronyms and stuff like that at the beginning that I think more veteran scientists will know. But
Yeah, it's a broad audience here, as you know,
yeah.
so I think that's perfect. Hello, everyone, and thanks for attending today's CGD seminar. Before we get started, I'll remind everyone of our CGD code of conduct at these seminars, where we share the air, acknowledge teamwork, encourage innovation, show appreciation, consider new ideas, and offer constructive feedback. I'll also ask that everyone please keep themselves muted and hold any questions until the end. If you have a burning clarification question, feel free to enter it in the chat, and I can pass that along to our speaker. Now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Luke Parsons is a postdoctoral associate and lecturer in the Nicholas School of the Environment at Duke University. He received a bachelor's in geological sciences and Spanish from Brown University, after which he taught high school science and geology before completing a PhD in geosciences from the University of Arizona. He was then a WRF postdoctoral fellow in atmospheric sciences at the University of Washington before starting his current position. Luke's research interests and expertise include climate variability and its impact on labor and human health, droughts, and paleoclimatology. His talk title today is Magnitudes and Spatial Patterns of Forced and Unforced Interdicadal Temperature Variability in CMIP-6 Models. So Luke, go ahead and share your screen and take it away.
Will do. Can you give me a thumbs up if you can see it after I share it, please? Great. Hi, everybody. I don't know what you'll be seeing on your end, but I tried to keep a little blank box in the upper right-hand corner. So if you want to put my video up there, go ahead. That's where you should be seeing your video. So before I get started, I want to say thank you so much to Dan, specifically for the introduction here. I appreciate that Clara invited me. She came out and spoke at Duke, and then I wanted to hear a little bit more about my work. So thank you, Clara, and also thanks for Tracy for organizing. And all of you, I recognize this is going to be 45 minutes of your time. So thank you for your time attending. I'll try to make it worth your while, make it interesting. Additionally, as Dan mentioned, I was funded by the WRF. That's not some sort of atmospheric model. It's the Washington Research Foundation postdoctoral fellowship. People always confuse the two, but they funded my work while I was at University of Washington in atmospheric sciences. Also, a lot of this work came out of discussions with postdocs and grad students in Greg Hakems and David Battisti's groups at University of Washington. So thanks to them for including me. And specifically, now Dr. Katie Brennan was a grad student at the time. She's second author on the paper. She and Rob and Christy did a great job helping me along and pushing some really cool science out of this project. If you want to read more about it, it was published in 2020 in Geophysical Research Letters. Also, of course, a lot of these kind of big data analysis problems can't be done without folks sharing the data. So I want to thank Noah. And also I would like to thank the CMIP folks, Coupled Model Intercomparison Project, and Earth System Grid Federation, and all of the participating modeling centers, because we can't do these multi-model comparison project type science work without all of them running the models on their computers. So I'm going to think that today I can motivate my talk both from a scientific and a practical perspective. I think I'm just going to try to go right for the practical, because I think there's a lot of scientific interest here if you're a climate modeler. But I think a lot of this can be motivated by questions you might get on an airplane if you're a climatologist. Specifically, I go in and I sit down, and let's say I'm in seat 22B, and someone might sit next to me, seat 22C, and you might say, so what do you do? And depending on how much I feel like talking about work, I might get into some detail, but I might just say, I study climate or I study drought. And if I mention that I study climate or climate change impacts, there can sometimes be a bit of an awkward pause. And then I can get a comment that's something like, I don't believe in global warming because climate is just always changing. So let's use seat 22C's comment here as motivation for my talk. I don't believe in global warming because climate is always changing. And this brings up this question of how much natural variability is there in the climate system before humans start warming it with greenhouse gases? And can we distinguish between climate change and natural climate variability, not just from the magnitudes of variability or change, but specifically due to the spatial patterns? Now, I want to recognize that hopefully we have some early career scientist folks here who are maybe undergrads or PhD students. And this was my talk title, Magnitudes and Spatial Patterns of Forced and Unforced Interdictable Variability in CMIP 6. There's an there's an acronym there. And right off the bat, there's forced and unforced interdecadal variability. Maybe you don't know what that is. That's jargon within the climate field. So I'll very briefly, before I get into the meat of my talk about definitions and context here. Specifically, what do I mean by forced versus unforced climate variability? What do I mean by interdecadal versus interannual climate variability? What the heck does CMIP 6 mean? Maybe you've never seen this acronym. And then I'll get into global mean surface temperature variability, the magnitudes, how much variability there is, and the spatial patterns or spatial drivers or spatial fingerprints of this global mean surface temperature variability. First, forced versus unforced climate variability. What am I talking about here? I think that if you are a climate scientist, you've probably seen a similar graph to this ad nauseum. If you're not, let me briefly explain. This is global mean surface temperature time series from the NASA GISTEMP data set. On the x-axis down here, we're looking at years from 1880 up to about 2019. And then on the y-axis, we're looking at temperature differences from the baseline or the 1951 to 1980 average. And I think that this last about 70 years of this trend, people recognize this as a global warming trend. And this is what I'll be talking about mostly as externally forced today in my talk. In other words, forcing that's imposed on the climate system. Let's say if we add aerosols to the atmosphere, or let's say we add greenhouse gases that are trapping outgoing long wave radiation that are warming the planet. I'll contrast this then with internal variability, unforced variability. And usually what we're talking about here is ocean-atmosphere interactions. Specifically, we could think of interannual variability between the ocean and the atmosphere. If you're familiar with El Nino and La Nina, here I'm highlighting years when it gets warmer and then cooler again just for a year or two. But also we could have internal unforced variability on these interdecadal timescales where global mean temperatures swing up and down relatively slowly from decade to decade. To focus your eye in on this, I've just low pass filtered the data to remove the interannual variability. Now we're just looking at decade to decade or century to century variability. And you might think, well, this is kind of long time scale type variability. Why should we bother understanding it? First of all, if there's really strong internal climate variability and we impose a warming trend on this strong internal climate variability, global or local warming can proceed rather jaggedly, or kind of like a staircase where you could have time periods where you have warming that slows down and then it reaccelerates. By contrast, if you have really strong external forcing in the presence of very little internal variability, maybe just every year gets a little bit warmer than the last. Also, a lot of my motivation for my talk today is just the basic idea here of understanding ongoing warming. How much of this could be internal variability that's just purely natural versus forced by humans adding greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. Finally, I won't get into this too much, but if we want to do any kind of decadal predictability of climate, we need to understand the forced response of the climate system, but also the internal decadal scale climate variability within the system. So today then, I'll be talking about mostly internal intradecadal climate variability of global mean surface temperatures, both the magnitude and the kind of geographic origins of this variability. And if we're going to study the magnitude and origins of internal climate variability, you might think, no problem, we've got instrumental data. Let's turn to these great satellites. Well, first, I've highlighted here in this gray box, this is our satellite area of the last 40 years, going back to about 1979 or 1980. There aren't really any data before that. If we go back to the pre-satellite era, we have relatively few observations, particularly over isolated continental areas or over oceans. To illustrate my point, I pulled a figure from Clara Desser's 2010 paper looking at the number of basically measurements per month or percent of months that have good observations. This is in the 20 years leading up to the satellite era. And the hot colors here indicate many observations and the cool colors indicate few observations. So notice really well observed oceans in the mid latitudes in the Northern Hemisphere, almost no observations over the Southern Ocean. And if we march back to the 20 years before World War II, even fewer observations in the Pacific and Southern Ocean. And if we get back to the 1860s to the 1880s or 1870s, almost no observations over many ocean regions. So clearly we have issues with instrumental data here for studying longer timescales of variability and forced change. We have incomplete spatial coverage, as I just mentioned. And additionally, as some of Patrick Brown's work back in 2017 in Nature Climate Change showed, warming itself can actually alter internal climate variability itself. So it becomes a bit difficult to study internal variability if our warming is actually altering it. So in addition to instrumental data, what else could we use to study internal climate variability? So I mentioned we have instrumental data. Today, I'll be mostly focusing on climate model simulations. I also originally was going to talk about some paleoclimate field reconstructions, but I pulled that out of my talk because it takes too long to get into the details. So I'll mostly be focusing on climate models. But if you want to ask me about some of our paleoclimate results when I'm done, I'm happy to share that. So I'll remind you, my main questions for today are what I'll be focusing in on is how much internal climate variability is there? Could internal climate variability explain observed warming? And when you get to some of my results here in a second, you might be rolling your eyes at the second one. You say, well, of course not. But let me show you some of the results from the CMIP6 archive. And then are the spatial patterns associated with global climate variability on these longer timescales, are they distinct in internal variability versus forced climate change? So as I mentioned, I'll be mostly using climate model data, specifically CMIP data. If you don't know what this acronym means, it's Coupled Model Intercomparison Project. And these are publicly available collections of climate model output from different research groups around the world, such as NCAR. Several generations of CMIP have come to pass over the last 30 years. So today specifically, I'll be focusing on CMIP3, CMIP5, and mostly CMIP6 model simulations that are publicly available and free online. If, again, CMIP3 doesn't mean anything to you, think back to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report in 2007. The CMIP3 models were used in that report. If you think of the assessment report 5 from the IPCC that came out in 2013, that's where the CMIP5 models were used. And then the CMIP6 models, in addition to being their own scientific endeavors, were also used in this recent IPCC AR6 report that came out last fall. And the last two working groups came out, in the last month or two, I think. So mostly these are relatively new model simulations. And when I wrote this paper back in 2020, they were kind of hot off the supercomputers, I guess you could call it. And so I'm going to be focusing mostly on these newer model results. Specifically, I'll be using pre-industrial control simulations. You'll see these abbreviated PI control. And what this basically means is that you run the climate model out for many centuries. And you just let the ocean, atmosphere, land, and ice interact, mostly ocean atmosphere variability on these longer timescales, with no time-varying external forcing. In other words, what we're looking at here is just greenhouse gases held steady at their pre-industrial state. They're not varying. And then we can go up to the historical runs. The historical runs have ocean atmosphere variability, but we've also imposed greenhouse gas forcing on them from people, and also aerosols, let's say from people, also from volcanoes going off. Additionally, I'll be using several instrumental-based data sets, including several from all the different agencies that produce global instrumental data sets. I'll be using a common period after 1880 because that's when the NASA GISTUMP and I think the NOAA global temperature data sets go back to 1880, all the way basically up to the present. And briefly here, I'll remind you I have our 3 questions. The magnitude of global mean variability, what's the magnitude of warming century to century in control runs versus historical runs, and what are the spatial patterns associated with global mean temperature variability. And so let me run through very briefly how I'm going to define the first 2, and I'll get into the last one later. So the first one, the magnitudes of global mean surface temperature or climate variability. What I did is I took each climate model and I looked at the skin surface temperature or surface air temperature variable. And I removed the linear trend over the full control run of the climate model, and I looked at 400 years. And now we're going to be looking at anomalies from the long-term mean. Here's 400 years on the x-axis. The y-axis are going from temperature anomalies from the long-term mean between -1 and 1. And so here's, for example, the CESM2 model. You can see it varies on interannual timescales and decade to decade and century to century. So then what I did is I just took a 25-year low-pass filter of global mean surface temperatures, and that's what this red line is showing you. And the way I'm defining the magnitude of climate variability on these longer timescales is I'm just looking at the standard deviation of that red line. Then I'll also be looking at trends in global mean surface temperature in 100-year windows. I'll get into that later. And I'll also be looking at the coherence of global mean surface temperatures versus local surface temperature variability. And I'll get into that later in my talk when I actually talk about that. So let's hop into this first question. How much internal climate variability is there in each of these different climate models? And I want to remind you, because everyone always asks me this when I show them these results, this is just control run variability, no time varying external forcing. And I'll be showing you a bunch of different little graphs here. These graphs all have the exact same X and Y axes. The X axis is over the course of 400 years, and the Y axis goes from -0.8 degrees to 0.8 degrees. And we'll be just looking at the anomalies from the long-term mean in the climate model for global mean surface temperatures. For example, then, here's EC Earth, one of the European climate models, and global mean surface temperature variability on these in this red line on interdecadal timescales. There's a lot of variability there. The standard deviation of this red line is 0.23 degrees. Now, here's one of the climate models. Remember, we have, I think, 39 of these from when I did this paper a couple years ago. So I'm going to show you results from all of the models. You don't have to look at all of them, but I've organized them from most variable in the upper left, going across almost like reading a book, left to right and down. And then as you go down, we go down to the least variable models. And don't read any of the numbers. They all have the same axes, but you can immediately see, though, that some of these climate models, internal ocean atmosphere variations, drive massive changes from decade to decade to century, versus if you go to this bottom row here, it's basically flat. So I would like you to imagine that we only had this one climate model simulation. We didn't have all the different modeling agencies with their different ocean and atmosphere models. And this was our one view of the pre-industrial climate. We would have a very, very different view of climate than if we had run one of these other climate models down here. So these are very, very different pre-industrial worlds, the least variable climate models in the CMIP6 archive versus the most variable climate models. To help focus your eye in on this, I just picked the EC Earth model and then the CESM2 high top model, whack 'em. So we have the EC Earth 3 model here that I already showed you, then the CESM2. And you can see that there's basically about 3 times as much variability in this most variable model versus one of these models that kind of falls right in the middle. And if we look at the least variable compared to the most variable, there's sometimes 6 times more variability across the climate models. Then this immediately made me wonder, wow, there's a lot of temperature variability and warming of decade to decade and century to century. How does this compare if we look at force changes in the instrumental data set? So let's look here at EC Earth 3 again on the left, and then on the right here is 400 years on the x-axis, just going from 1880 up to basically 2020. And if you put a 100-year window on both of these, that's the size of this blue box, the width here, you'll notice that you get these swings in global mean temperatures that almost look like they're equal to one another, which really made me raise my eyebrows here and brought up this question: could internal climate variability from some of these climate model simulation explain observed warming? So to define this question, I'm just going to be looking at 100-year linear trends, and I'll be asking, do CMIP6 control runs linear trends over 100-year time windows ever exceed the observed warming trends over the last 100 years or so? So to do this, I'm going to look at a 400-year time series, and I'm going to take this blue box and I'll just slide it through and I'll calculate a 100-year linear trend through the whole time series. And you'll notice it's actually a pretty good fit here. But if I go out to a 100-year window here, it's not always a really good fit. This is just one metric we're using here. I'm going to be showing you a series of violin plots here. They're basically histograms or distributions like box plots. And I'll be showing you some from the control runs from the climate models, and then to the right of this dashed line from the instrumental data from 1880 to the present. And if you're not familiar with violin plots, I know several people I talk to aren't. Basically here, it's a smooth histogram that's flipped on its side, where the thick areas are high data density areas and the skinny areas are low data density areas. And so each of the data points that go into making this histogram is from one of these 100-year linear trends as I slide this window 1 year at a time through the entire time series. So you'd see that these are mostly focused down here. So let's do the same thing from 1880 up to the present and just slide our 100-year window through the instrumental data. And that's what these histograms violin plots look like over here on the right. So we have our NASA GISS temp data and we have our Berkeley Earth data. So each one of these data sets from the instrumental data. And you'll see that there's about anywhere between 0.4 degrees of warming per century if we just look at that time period, 1880 to 1980, versus if we get up to the last 100 years, there's about 1 degree of warming per 100 years, or a linear trend. And clearly we have some sort of spread in the instrumental data, right? They don't all perfectly agree with each other. I want to emphasize we're basically using the same instrumental observation systems here, but there's just different methods for spatial interpolation and things like that. Now, what about these control runs from the climate models? That's what I'll be showing you all the violin plots marching across here in this other section. Now we get a big spread. Over here on the right, I've organized them from most variable climate models over here to least variable, and global mean surface temperature trends. There would be 0 on this dashed line, and then 1 would be up here, and -1 would be down here. So clearly some of these models show very, very small trends on 100-year timescales in the control runs, and others show larger trends. And I think these spreads are more due to uncertainties in, let's say, model physics and ocean overturning circulation and how we simulate that, for example. So let me focus your eye in first then on these less variable CMIP6 models. So roughly 80 to 85% of these 39 or 40 model simulations tend to really agree with each other pretty darn well. And they'll never have a trend over 100 years that really exceeds 0.4 degrees of warming or 0.4 degrees of cooling per 100 years. And that kind of falls nicely underneath the 1880 to 1980 trend, which are these bottom dots over here from the instrumental data. But what about these most variable CMIP6 models? You take 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, about 7 of the 39 models here. They tend to have a little more variability on these longer timescales. They can have anywhere from trends that go from about -0.7 degrees per 100 years all the way up to 0.9 degrees per 100 years. And if I look across the entire archive and look at all the sliding 100-year trends, how often do we maybe exceed these minimum trends from the instrumental data? Maybe only 3% of the time out of all of these centuries. These are these upper bits of the histograms or box plots, violin plots here. We could ask then, how often does the control run variability in these most variable models exceed the warming trends of the last 100 years? And we basically find that these upper dots up here all fall above even the top dots or the top edges of these violin plots up here. So all the pre-industrial control trends are less than the maximum observed warming trends from the control runs from the models. So even if we have some wildly variable CMIP6 model, like one of these 3 over here on the left, internal variability never generates global warming trends that exceed 0.8 or 0.9 degrees Celsius per 100 years. Okay, then you could say, what about relative to previous generations of climate models or relative to observations? How much variability is in these models? So I just showed you 100-year trends. I'd like to emphasize we're going to be going back to looking at the standard deviation of interdecadal global mean surface temperature variability. I'll be showing you a series of violin plots again, and on the y-axis here is the standard deviation of global mean surface temperature variability, and then we'll be marching through a series of violin plots. So here's the results from the 39 postage stamp models I'm showing you here. So the median is about 0.07 degrees. So most of the NCAR model simulations kind of fall right down here, whereas some of the European and Chinese climate models fall up in this range. And if we compare it to the previous generations of models, now the blue is CMIP5 and this gold color is CMIP3, you'll notice that most of the models across all the generations from CMIP3 to CMIP5 to CMIP6 tend to kind of agree with each other in terms of how much global mean surface temperature variability there is. But you'll have about 5 of these climate models that just came out in the last couple of years that have more variability than any of the previous model generations. And I'm going to skip this, but they have also shown more variability than the last Millennium CMIP5 simulations, as well as our paleoclimate reconstructions of the last 400 or 500 years or so. Now, I'm wondering immediately then, how do these climate models perform when forced with greenhouse gases, aerosols, etc.? So first, let's look at our instrumental data. So what I did here is I just looked, for example, at the NASA GISTEMP data set like I showed you before, and I just looked at the standard deviation of this time series, and I did this for each of our instrumental data sets. That's where each of these dots comes from in this violin plot. So this is internal climate variability plus this warming trend. So then let's look at the CMIP3 simulations, the CMIP5 and CMIP6. So now we've forced the climate models with greenhouse gas, aerosol, land use change, etc. So immediately you can say, well, several of these climate models really fall within the envelope of what we see from the instrumental data in the 20th century. But I wanted to know, is there a relationship, though, between how well the models perform in the historical runs and how well they perform in the control runs? Maybe we could use the instrumental data as some sort of constraint to constrain pre-instrumental climate variability. And this is, I'm not the first one to come up with this idea. I think Peter Cox had a paper in 2018 on this, where they seem to suggest that, oh, maybe you could use the control run variability to say something about climate sensitivity. So I was wondering, is there any relationship between the variability and trends in the historical runs and the control run variability? So what I'm going to show you here is a scatter plot, and on the x-axis is going to be the interdecadal variability in the control runs, and on the y-axis is the variability plus trends in the CMIP5 or CMIP6 historical runs and in the instrumental data after 1880. And then this is the one-to-one line here. And so more variable in the historical will be above the line, and more variable in the control runs will be below the line. And so if I scatter the two against each other, green dots are CMIP6, blue dots are CMIP5. And if I try to run some sort of correlation, is there a relationship between the two? There's a very weak relationship in CMIP6 and basically non-existent in CMIP5. And I think that this relationship is mostly driven in CMIP6 by this outlier here, the ECR3 model. So the control run variability doesn't really explain most of the historical run trends plus variability. Clearly, climate sensitivity and other factors are really important. We can't really use these, I think, as some sort of constraint. And let me help hammer this point home. Let me put the instrumental data here. So if we look at the standard deviation of interdecadal global mean climate variability plus the warming trend, this is where our instrumental data fall here. And so you can see that some of these climate models really group up within the envelope of instrumental data, even one out here does. And most of the climate models that agree with the instrumental data tend to kind of fall inside of this range here in their control runs. But should we put faith in maybe this model over this model? And big red flag here, I think a lot of people have talked about this recently. Each estimate of variability is from one model iteration. And I want to emphasize, we should not be just using one model iteration to try to say if a historical run from one of these climate models has done a good job. For example, this is CNRM CM6, one of the European climate models. They have 30 historical runs. They've branched off from different portions in the control run and forced it with greenhouse gases up to the present. And I'd like to emphasize, I showed you this one dot that was the first run in iteration from their large ensemble. But if I did this for all 30 runs, you would get this giant envelope here. And so maybe you would have wanted to throw out CNRM if you picked run 1, iteration 1, but if you picked run 2, it might have fallen right within this envelope. If you did this for the Canadian Earth System model, it actually interestingly never really falls within the envelope of the instrumental data. For the NCAR CESM2, I didn't grab the large ensemble data. I just grabbed the 11 runs that were on the Earth System Grid Federation. It falls within here. And also this envelope expanded out here because the NCAR model nicely has, I think, 1,200 years from the control run. And so if I grab different sections of the control run, there can actually be different amounts of internal variability across the control run within the model. So that's why this box got bigger. And then if I did this for EC Earth, our most variable model, it just so happened the one I happened to initially download and publish in our paper in GRL, it was this point all the way up here. But if I looked at one of the other 25 runs in the EC Earth 3 large ensemble, it could go all the way down here for with one of our historical runs having almost no trends in the historical run versus all the way up here, where you have internal variability combining with a warming trend to make this kind of huge warming trend in some of the other ensemble members. So clearly here, internal variability and initial conditions are important. And I think if we're going to try to use historical runs to, let's say, constrain climate models, we need to be careful with how we're doing it. We need to use these large ensembles or multiple runs if we're able to do so. Okay, I know this was a lot. Let me go through a recap so far. So there's clearly a large range in estimates of internal or natural climate variability across these CMIP6 models. Some of the CMIP6 models show more variability than CMIP3 models or CMIP5 models, or I've deleted this paleo data too, and paleoclimate model simulations of the last millennium. This quote unquote global warming in the pre-industrial climate never really shows trends though that are equal to observed recent warming, even our most variable CMIP6 models. All right, so remember my questions here was how much internal climate variability is there in these models? There's a big range. Could internal climate variability explain observed warming, especially the last 100 years, or maybe the last 70 years? The answer is no. And then let's get to my final question. What are the spatial fingerprints associated with global mean surface temperature variability on these interdecadal timescales? Is there a fingerprint of internal climate variability versus forced climate change? So we can ask then kind of which regions are associated with or are driving these large interdecadal swings in global mean surface temperature, GMST. To look at this, I'll be looking at the coherence of global versus local variability. And let me illustrate this. So I've grabbed the global mean surface temperature time series from one of the climate models. Same thing I showed you before, 400 years, varying about a long-term mean of 0. And then I could also grab, let's say, one grid point from the North Atlantic and plot it on top of this here in blue, 40 degrees north, 20 degrees west. And you can squint at this and you could say, well, is this relationship significant? At what time scales? Which time series leads? And this is where I'll be using this multi-taper method spectral coherence, where we ask how do two time series covary as a function of time scale? And what's the phase of the relationship? If we almost think of these two time series as sine waves, does one of them lead the other versus lag the other as well? So I can run this coherence calculation, and what we get out is basically correlation as a function of time scale. So on this axis is not time, it's period or frequency of variability going from interannual to decadal to centennial. And then on this axis is going to be increasing covariability. From 0 would be no covariability, all the way up to 1 would be perfectly covarying at that time scale. Also, this can be kind of noisy calculation. So if you do some sort of random draw or something like that, you can find that there's a noise threshold here. So here, if I look at the coherence between the global mean and local time series, that's what this blue line is showing you. So on these shorter timescales, interannual timescales, we don't really exceed the noise threshold. But if we get out to these longer timescales, past about 20 years, we notice that there's pretty significant coherence that exceeds this noise threshold. And if we look at the average coherence at these longer timescales, it's about 0.66. And this is the metric that I'll be using. I'll be taking the average interdecadal centennial scale coherence, and I'll be plotting it on a map. And the darker colors will indicate higher coherence between global and local variability at these longer timescales. Lighter colors would be less covariability. And clearly you can see if I do this for every location around the globe, we start getting some spatial patterns that pop out, or regions that have darker blue, right? So we get the Eastern Tropical Pacific, the North Pacific, the North Atlantic, maybe the Arctic or the Southern Ocean. If I then ask, where do we meet the significance threshold? And also local variability has to at least be in phase or lead global variability. That's where we get the stippling on the maps to indicate regions of significance. And so again, the Arctic, North Pacific, North Atlantic, Eastern Tropical Pacific, and some areas in the Southern Ocean tend to pop out. Now, this was just one of our climate models. This is the Canadian Earth System model, for example. What if I did this calculation and showed you a coherence map across all of them? What do the fingerprints of global mean surface temperature variability look like across the whole CMIP6 archive? So again, what I've done here is I've run this calculation, made this map, and now displaying the results from most variable climate models up here at the top. Then we'll march down, we'll have to the least variable climate models down here at the bottom. Too many little tiny maps to look at, I recognize. So let me focus your eye in on, I'll pull some of these out and make them bigger. We're going to look at the 3 most variable models, kind of 3 models that fall in the middle, and the 3 least variable climate models from the archive. So first, let's look at the 3 most variable climate models, the EC Earth model, the BCC model, and the CNRM model. Basically, all of these tend to indicate that there's some sort of like high latitude or almost hemispheric pattern of coherence that varies with the global mean on these longer timescales. For these 2 European climate models, it's the Northern Hemisphere. For the BCC model, it's the Southern Hemisphere. If we look at, let's say, the Canadian Earth System model, or the, I think, Alfred Wegener Institute model, the Norwegian climate model, it tends to be more of a kind of PDO, stands for Pacific Decadal Oscillation, or Interdecadal Pacific Oscillation pattern, kind of this Eastern Pacific pattern. Maybe there's some North Atlantic that pops out here, maybe a little bit of Arctic, where we have stippling as well. Same with some of our least variable climate models. It tends to be PDO or IPO pattern with some Arctic in there, or North Atlantic. So if I look at the average coherence maps across the entire CMIP6 archive, then you get what you see here, where clearly we have some areas that are slightly darker blue and some areas that are slightly lighter blue. And if we ask, well, where do 2/3 or about 26 out of the 39 models agree that there's a significant relationship between global and local variability, these long timescales? That's where we get these dots where I've highlighted with these boxes. The stippling program I used actually left out a couple here because of the spacing. There should be a little bit of the Eastern Pacific, but mostly the North Atlantic and going into kind of the Arctic or Northern Asia. These are the regions that most of the models tend to agree are kind of driving or associated with global mean temperature variability at these longer timescales. Now, let's get to that question then. What are the spatial fingerprints of internal versus forced? Because so far we've just looked at internal climate variability in the CMIP6 models. So this is what I just showed you. These are the pre-industrial control multi-model mean maps from 39 climate models. Remember, this is unforced ocean-atmosphere interactions. Then if we take the historical runs from those same climate models and impose transient greenhouse gas forcing and aerosols, land use change, et cetera, on those models, and you start noticing that there immediately are differences, both in the magnitudes, right? This one's darker blue than this one. There's more coherence basically around the globe, and in the spatial patterns, right? It isn't so much of an Eastern Pacific, North Atlantic pattern that pops out here, but much more of a kind of tropical pattern that pops out in the forced runs. So the next thing I said, well, we have a few instrumental data sets that are mostly global, the 20th century reanalysis, the Berkeley Earth surface temperature, and the NASA GISTEMP data. So if I run an analysis that's pretty similar over the globe for the instrumental data, do we get a relatively similar pattern as the historical runs from these climate models? And so, yeah, the answer is basically, yes, we get relatively similar pattern, but let's look at this a little more in terms of the zonal mean coherence. So we're going to take an average across each latitudinal band and put it on a line plot over here. So coherence on this axis going from 0 to 1, latitude, South Pole, equator with the dashed line, North Pole up here at 90 degrees north. The dashed line I have on here is that 0.4 to 0.5 of the coherence that's the noise threshold. And then the thick blue line is the multi-model median in the zonal mean, and then the thinner lines are the 95% range. So if you take the zonal means here, you immediately start noticing that most of the models, like we showed you with the stippling earlier, show a kind of high latitude coherence pattern in the multi-model mean. But if we look at the historical runs and look at the zonal mean, you start noticing this is not the same, right? So if we add greenhouse gas and aerosol forcing, there's more of a strong tropical coherence pattern that pops out, in addition to some high latitude, especially over the Arctic. And I think this is our Arctic amplification of global warming, for example, of what's popping out here. And then if we do the same thing for the instrumental data, the NASA GISTEMP data is missing over the higher latitudes, so we don't have data here and here. But when we get to the mid to lower latitudes, we kind of qualitatively get a relatively similar pattern where we have high coherence specifically peaking near the equator and then dropping off at mid latitudes, which is not what we get from the control runs. So let's take a closer look at these coherence patterns in the climate models that are externally forced versus internal climate variability. So we'll look at a multi-model mean difference coherence map. So we're take the historical run coherence map and subtract the control run coherence map, where red indicates more local coherence with global mean in the historical runs versus in the control runs. So you basically can see that there's a large increase in coherence of variability at these longer timescales all across the tropics. And what we wanted to know, though, was like, why the heck do we see this specific pattern? To delve a little more deeply into this, I think what we need to look at, though, is the magnitude, not of coherence, but of local interdecadal climate variability in the control runs of the climate models. So here, darker red indicates a higher local standard deviation of global means of local surface temperature variability, and the lighter colors indicate low magnitude standard deviation. So you see there's high magnitude interdecadal climate variability kind of over sea ice regions or edges up into the Arctic in these regions. And then we have low magnitude near zero interdecadal climate variability in these really light regions here. So why this pattern of near zero variability? If you notice, this is also where we tend to have regions of high coherence that really pop out if we look at the difference in the control run versus the historic runs. Christy actually suggested, one of the co-authors, he'd been working in David Battisti's group, and they've been looking a lot at kind of some spatial patterns of warming and all. And Christy had suggested, why don't we go ahead and figure out, this looks a lot like where we have regions of deep convection. So he suggested, why don't we grab this omega variable, 500 millibar upward vertical motion in the atmosphere. So these dashed lines that I'm showing you here, this is their regions of deep convection in the tropics. And notice that they line up not perfectly, but almost perfectly with where we have regions of almost no interdecadal climate variability at low latitudes. Now, let's contrast this then just visually briefly here with the historical runs. Notice the historical runs, if we look at the local standard deviation of surface temperature, now this is internal variability plus the warming trends. You notice that you immediately see that there's more local variability plus trends. So we're now going to subtract these two and look at where there's the largest increases in local variability, I guess plus trends as well, with forcing. So now I'm going to show you a map. And the map will have purple, where there's large increases in the standard deviation of local temperature variability, and green would indicate there's less local temperature variability in the historical versus control runs. So if we notice that this entire map is basically purple, we have the highest magnitude increases in forced variability or warming trends, we should think of them specifically in the far North Arctic, right? This is Arctic amplification, and somewhat maybe over the Southern Ocean. And then we have these lower magnitude increases in forced variability or warming trends over in these regions of deep convection. So we're not really seeing that pattern that I showed you. But if we look at the percent changes in magnitude, in other words, how much more variability do we get in historical runs versus the control runs locally? Then if that's what we map up, this is where this pattern really pops out, where it's these regions of deep convection in the tropics. So to remind you then, what we're looking at here, this is the local variability versus the change in variability in the historical runs as a percent of local variability in the control runs. So remember the regions that are really dark here, this is where we have low near zero internal climate variability. And as I mentioned, these are regions of deep convection in the tropics where it's really difficult to maintain unforced, let's say, warming or cooling for a long, mostly warming for a long period of time without just like radiating this energy out to space. So if we go back then and look at this pattern of coherence that changes from the historical versus the control runs, you can see that we have these especially large changes in coherence of global versus local variability plus trends in these regions of deep convection. And this is, I think, important because these are similar to regions we might expect to feel the impacts of climate change first. If you're familiar at all with Hawkins and Sutton 2012, the time of emergence paper that said, okay, for example, if you look over somewhere like the Amazon, global warming is felt there first, even if the trends aren't that large. versus a kind of mid or high latitude region where you have a lot of internal climate variability. So maybe it's harder to feel global warming locally. All right, so let's go back to that airplane ride. Someone sits down next to me and says, I don't believe in global warming because climate is always changing. So this prompts me to ask then, well, how much natural climate variability was there before we started warming the climate system? And remember that what I showed you here, there's a range in the magnitude of decadal variability with some of the climate models that are clear outliers that have a lot more variability than the others. And as I mentioned, right, there's several outliers. Then despite this, though, you can have some of these outlier climate models, but even the most kind of hottest warming century in the internal climate variability in some of these CMIP6 control runs, they never show global warming trends that exceed the last 100 years of instrumental warming. So you could say, yeah, sure, there's a lot of internal climate variability, but not enough to explain the recent global warming or climate change, even in the climate models that I think have kind of an unrealistically high amount of internal climate variability. But then even if some of these climate models do produce a huge amount of internal climate variability, could we distinguish between climate change and natural variability more based on their spatial patterns? And remember, this is then what I wanted to show you here was that there's a distinct, I think, pattern of the coherence of variability at these longer and trends at these longer timescales in the forced runs versus in the internal variability in the control runs, right? Where it's like much stronger coherence of variability in certain regions and globally. So I would say there's more of a fingerprint of forced interdecadal variability and warming in these regions of deep convection. And also warming is more truly global than in the control runs of the models, where it's much more like regionally or hemispherically driven over certain ocean basins. So you could say even if internal variability could generate warming that approaches observed warming, the spatial patterns, I think, tend to be distinct if we look at coherence of global and local variability on these longer timescales. So thank you very much for your time. And with that, I'll put up a couple of my main results here and I'll take questions.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Luke, for sharing your work.
Yeah.
We have lots of time for questions, so folks can please feel free to raise their hands, or you can enter a question in the chat and I will read it out loud. Question from Gokhan, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess, thank you for the presentation. I guess you may have answered the question that I'm going to ask in your last slide. When you look at the control simulations, PI control simulations, the variability and the trends might be quite unrealistic. In addition, they can be completely due to different physical reasons, such as Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, differences, or formation and disappearance of polynyas in the Southern Ocean, particularly in the Vidalcion centennial timescales. So those high sort of variability in trend models may be reflecting some of those. I guess
exactly.
Another comparison could be made based on what the actual physical mechanisms are for the trends and variability in the PI control as opposed to the historical simulations.
Yeah, exactly. And I was pretending we could almost be blind to the physical mechanisms of variability. Let's pretend we don't understand anything about greenhouse gas forcing and physics of warming. Let's just look at the magnitudes. But I totally agree with you. And I think that if we wanted to look at what the heck is going on with these most variable climate models, if we look at EC Earth, CNRM, and I think the IPSL model, these three European climate models all updated to this newest ocean version of NEMO. And then you look at the BCC climate model and then one of the GFDL models, they both use the same ocean model. And they are the ones that show the Southern Ocean variability. And like you said, I talked to some folks at GFDL and they're like, I think this just has to do with the formation of leads and polynyas in the Southern Ocean. And then it seems to be there's just some interesting variability with really strong variations in the AMOC and the North Atlantic with the NEMO model with the European climate model. Yeah. Yeah. Does that answer your question or address?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, it does. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. Clara, go ahead.
Hi, Luke. That was just just a beautiful, beautiful presentation. So thank you.
Oh, thanks. I appreciate that.
Yeah, you're just such a great speaker. I just had a small question, and that was whether you had investigated at all whether there are forced changes in either the magnitude and or spatial pattern of the internal variability, i.e. by comparing, the character of the internal variability in the control runs and in the historical runs. You mentioned, that that's a possibility at the outset, and I wondered if you had looked at that yet.
Well, I guess so. I don't know if I'm answering your question right. So I did look at those coherence patterns in the historical versus the control runs. Is that kind of what you're asking? Or are you looking? I'm not sure if I totally understand your question.
Okay, yeah, I was thinking if you took out the forced component from the historical runs, then you're isolating the internal variability, and whether that internal variability that's happening in the historical period differs in any way from the internal variability that happens.
That's a great idea.
1850. Yeah.
I like it. For example, let's say we had a large ensemble from one of the climate models where we could average together the local surface temperatures across 40 or 100 runs and then remove that and then look at the coherence.
Exactly.
Remove that. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think that's a great idea. I haven't actually specifically done that. It's funny with all the tinkering that I've done, I haven't gone about. That's a great idea. I'd be interested. If I do that, I'll let you know and I'll send you the map.
Yeah. Let's go for it. All right. Awesome. Thanks.
All right. I had a question. So Luke, there's a conversation in the paleo world, I think, about potential disagreements between the spectral energy in paleoclimate records and what we get in climate models on long time scales. And I was wondering if you could comment on the ability of maybe these spatial patterns to inform on that debate, and then also like maybe more broadly on the potential for sort of comparisons of spectral energy between models and data and what kind of insights those could provide.
So I mean, I guess one of the things that I worked on with Greg, getting about to your question here, Dan, at UW, is that we were interested in using paleoclimate field reconstructions to look at these coherence maps in the last millennium runs of the climate models versus in the last millennium reconstructions. So we can actually look at those spatial fingerprints. And so I think that the paleo data reconstructions and the paleoclimate model simulations tend to indicate that there's more of a kind of strong forced Western tropical Pacific regions of deep convection kind of pop out at these longer timescales. But then to get at your other question of I think you're talking about variance spectrum, like is there more variance at longer and longer timescales? Could we use these kinds of maps to fingerprint this? I haven't specifically thought about that a whole lot. I would be really interested to see kind of how much, let's say you use this ECR3 model to estimate what to compare to some paleo data and the slope of the spectrum of variability as some have done. Maybe there would be a lot more low frequency variability in some of these more variable climate models. I haven't really done that. I've looked at that a little bit just in the control runs of the models, but I haven't compared it actually to paleo data yet in these more variable models. So that's a kind of non-answer, I'm sorry. I think it'd be interesting, but I haven't done it. Do you have any suggestions?
No.
Okay.
I'll back away slowly. It was a tough question. Thanks, Luke. Yeah. Clara, another question?
If nobody else does, and if there's time. Okay, I just thought about your results that maybe they, are important to have something to say about this signal to noise paradox issue that you may be familiar with, because you're comparing straight up the interdecadal variance in historical runs with the instrumental record. And, a lot of models are encompassing the observed variance. And then you're showing us that the internal variability maybe doesn't depend on the forcing, or let's just say that's the case.
Yeah. Yeah.
then I wonder if a conclusion is that models have the right amplitude of interdecadal variability. I don't know if that was what Dan asked. I kind of tuned out while I was thinking about this.
I mean, I guess that's the thing here is that you might ask, well, which model? Because you say, well, do the models, and if you look, this is the standard deviation is 0.23 versus 0.04, we're talking almost 8 times the difference, 7 or 8 times the difference, right? And so if I grabbed this climate model and did some sort of comparison, I would probably say there's almost no variability at long time scales. Versus if I grabbed this model to run a comparison, there's a lot of variability. So I think you have to ask, well, which model are we comparing and what variable?
Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, I didn't have a well-formed question, but I think maybe something could be.
Yeah, Claire, I think to kind of follow up on what you're saying, yeah, like if you look at the EC Earth model and they have branched off from the control run, different historical runs, if you look at the historical runs, some of the global mean surface temperature time series are nearly flat because they're going through a cooling phase as we impose greenhouse gas forcing, and they almost kind of cancel each other out in the global mean. And then others, like I said, are just really take off because the entire northern hemisphere is warming anyway, and then we impose greenhouse gas forcing, and in those runs that have a huge amount of variability. So you're right, you can have this massive envelope of what you get as your answer depending on which of these ensemble members you pick from which of these models also. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. I see. Isla, do you have a question?
Yeah, I was going to ask it earlier, but then I thought it was kind of the same as Gokhan's, but no, maybe it's not. I'm just wondering if, like, yeah, based on this understanding of, for example, you mentioned polynyas and different ocean models, can we actually rule out these very high variability models and know that they're just not right?
I think it gets tricky. I mean, there's a piece of me that is really like, I really raise my eyebrows because if we go, for example, I blacked this out before or whited it out because I didn't want to talk about too much, but here's the last millennium simulations from the CMIP5 archive. Here's our paleoclimate reconstructions of 1450 to 1850. And so you've started imposing periodic volcanic forcing on top of the internal climate variability here. And you notice that like our 3 or 4 most variable models in the control runs from the CMIP6 archive fall outside of the envelope of the paleo reconstructions and of the paleo model runs. That really makes me raise my eyebrows. I think that we should, before Dan says anything and jumps in, we should be careful because the field reconstructions, I think, maybe should represent in some cases a basement on our estimates of variability because we're missing data over most of the oceans for these annual reconstructions. And so we might be missing some variance, but definitely I really raise my eyebrows at some of these models. If we compare them to, let's say, what observations we do have or model simulations of the last millennium that are forced. But then to get to your question, Isla, of like, well, how long is our record of observations of formation of leads and polynyas over the Southern Ocean to really constrain interdecadal variability? My guess is not very long. And what, at most 4 decades with satellite data. So I think it gets really hard to constrain the problem. Do you have any suggestions?
Not really, unless it just can be related to something climatological, you know, if like this, the sea ice looks unrealistic or something.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think that then we just have to go into a couple of these specific climate models and just probe a few of those questions, like where do some of these model variables or extent of some of the sea ice or something like that look pretty unrealistic, and maybe we should treat model simulation from that modeling center depending on the question with caution. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
All right, time for one more question from Rich.
Yeah, squeeze one in. Kind of a continuation of that, but you know, a lot of the patterns I see, it's not just a question of internal variability, but there's modal signatures to it, like the PDO.
Oh yeah.
You know, Indian Ocean Dipole and all NAO. And I'm wondering whether maybe you referred to this, but I wonder whether you've looked at the different contributions to kind of, weed out the ones that just don't have a PDO, which to me kind of looks like the BCC. So it has high internal variability, plus it doesn't have these other modes of variability. So I'm wondering whether
so I have a couple ways to answer your question. I mean, one, if you go in and actually look at the time series, let's say over the global or of the Southern Ocean, you just make a regional mean over parts of the Southern Ocean. There's massive swings up and down in temperatures locally. that just are perfectly coinciding with what's going on in the globe. So I think there's just like not a whole lot else going on with the other modes. Plus this one local mode is just massive. And then I want to say my paper didn't get into the mechanisms here, but Rob Will's paper in Journal of Climate that came out last fall or maybe last month, I can't remember it, a few months ago, he actually goes in and looks at the low frequency, he looks at a low frequency component analysis of these different models and looks at which of the kind of low frequency modes of variability are associated with some of these global mean temperature changes. And so you could look at his Journal of Climate paper on that.
Yeah, because this middle row here, the right.
Oh, I see Rob raised his hand.
Oh, the right two in this middle row,
Yeah.
they have about the
We got
same
the lead author right here on the line.
variance. But I'm tending to believe NOR-ESM more because it allows a kind of PDO type variance. That's all. Pattern. Thanks.
Yeah.
All right, time for a quick reply from Rob.
Yeah, just a quick comment in response to Rich's question. So all of these models in my 2021 paper, which Luke's a co-author on, focus more on the modal contributions to this global mean surface temperature variability. And all of the models do have PDO. They do have this AMV like Northern Hemisphere variability. They do have, and to some extent, they all have this Southern Ocean variability as well. It's more of differences in amplitudes. So models like EC Earth still do have a PDO. They just, the coherence of the global temperature is just dominated by this very large amplitude AMV-like variability.
Yeah.
All right, excellent. Well, let's thank the speaker once again. And thanks everyone for attending the seminar. And I look forward to seeing you next week. Take care.
Thank you.